Welcome to this YSL Report Builder tutorial. In this video we'll look at how you can calculate the difference between dates. We'll begin the video by introducing you to the DateDiff function, which is the main one we're going to be using throughout the video. We'll show you how you can calculate the difference in days between two dates, and also explain how you can deal with nulls in the date columns you're using. We'll then move on and look at how to calculate the difference in years and explain why the difference in years is not necessarily the same as the age in years. And we'll wrap up the video with a few different techniques you can use to calculate age accurately, rather than just using this simple trick of dividing the number of days by 365. So, quite a few interesting things to do here. Let's get started. To get started, I've created a new report in Report Builder. And the first thing we'll do, as usual, is create a connection to the YSL Movies database. Just as a quick reminder, if you don't already have that installed, you can follow along with this video, which explains exactly how to get it set up, and you'll find a link in that video's description to download any required files. Assuming you've done that part already, I'll head to my Data Sources folder, give it a right click, and choose Add Data Source. I'll call the data source Movies as usual, and I'll choose to use a connection embedded in the report. Make sure I'm connecting to a Microsoft SQL server, and then click the Build button to help me construct my connection string. I'm going to refer to my local instance of SQL Server, so I'll type in a // as a shortcut to the local host, and then the name of the instance in my case is SQL 2017. Yours may well be different, of course. Having done that, I can go to my drop-down list towards the bottom of the dialog box and select the Movies database, and then click OK a couple of times to get my data source created. Now that I have it, I can use it to create a data set. So I'll right click on it and choose Add Data Set. And I'll call this data set Actors, which again gives you a clue as to which table we're about to use. I'll click the Query Designer button, and then when that loads, I'll expand my Tables folder, followed by the Actor table, and select three columns, the full name, the DOB, and the DOD. Having done that, I'll click OK a couple of times, and there's my data set created as well. Now I'd just like to create a simple table to display the results from there. I'll tidy up my report a little bit. I'll select and then delete this placeholder title text box. Then right click in the page footer and choose to remove that. Then I'll right click into the report and choose Insert Table. I'll assign the three columns I've selected, full name, DOB, DOD. Just to avoid the text rendering bug, to make sure that some of my text doesn't get hidden when I run the report, I'll quickly select all the cells in the table and switch the font from the default to another font and then back to the default. Do some very basic formatting to highlight the column headers, and then having done that, change the column width, and then finally I just want to create a basic date format for the date of birth and date of death columns. So I'm going to select those two cells, DOB and DOD, in the detail row. Make sure that I can see my properties window by going to the View menu and choosing Properties. Scroll down the Properties window to find the Number Format property, and then I'll type in 2 lowercase d's, which will give me the number of the day of the month, followed by a space and then 3 uppercase m's, which will give me an abbreviated month name like Jan, Feb, etc. and another space and then 4 lowercase y's to get the year. Having done all that, I'm now going to run my report just to get a quick look at what it looks like. And I should see that for all of my actors I get their names followed by their dates of births, and for the actors which have them a date of death as well. I appreciate my database is a little out of date, so not all of this information is entirely up to date. So if there are any mistakes in there, it's simply because I haven't updated it yet. But there we go, there's the basics of creating the report. What we can do now is start working out some differences between the different dates in our dataset. The main function you're going to use when calculating the difference between dates in Report Builder is called DateDiff. Just to give you a brief introduction to how the DateDiff function works, I'd like to create a one-off expression which calculates how many days it is until Christmas Day 2020. So it's currently the 16th of December 2020 and I've just broken up from my Christmas holidays. I'd like to get a countdown to how many days it is until Christmas Day itself. To do that, I'm going to right click off the body of my report and add a page header. And then I'll right click in the page header and choose to insert a text box. And then I'll right click into the text box and choose Expression. Once I'm in the Expression Builder, I can go to the Common Functions category, choose date and time, and I'll find the DateDiff function on the third row, so I'll give it a quick double click to insert its name and open up the round brackets. Now there are 3 parameters to enter here. The first parameter specifies what interval of time I'm using to calculate the difference in. Do I want to know the difference in days, or in hours, or in weeks, in months, etc.? There are 2 different ways to specify the interval, as you can see in the examples in the bottom right hand corner. You can enter a string, which represents the interval, or you can use the date interval enumeration. There's a help page on the Microsoft Docs website for the date interval enum, and you'll find the full list of options available in that list there. So I'm going to go with the option called day. If I head back to the report builder, expression builder, I can type in date interval dot day. I'll follow that with a comma, and then I need to specify my starting date, which should be today's date. But I want to make sure that today's date is recalculated each day that I run the report. So to do that, I'm going to use the today function. I'll scroll down my list of date and time functions and find the today function, give it a double click to insert its name and open the round brackets. The today function doesn't actually have any parameters, so there is nothing to fill in inside the round brackets, but I do need to make sure that I close those. So I'll do that now. Then I can type in one more comma before I specify the end date. Now there's a suggestion if I switch back to the DateDiff function and highlight that in the list. It suggests you can just type a date in as a string in some double quotes, but that's a little prone to error and to ambiguity as well. It's not obvious whether that's day, month, year or month, day, year. So to avoid any kind of ambiguity, what I'm going to do is use another function to construct my date. There are 2 options here. I can use the date value function. If I select date value, that returns a date based on a descriptive string that you type in. So for example, I could say date value and then in some double quotes, 25 Dec 2020. Various date formats are recognised. As long as you make them unambiguous, then you'll get the date that you're interested in. So that's one way to do it. Preferably though, what I would do, I'm going to take away the date value function and I'm going to use the DateSerial function instead. If I double click to insert the DateSerial function, the examples aren't quite so obvious here, but what the DateSerial function does is it takes the number of the year, the number of the month and the number of the day that you want to generate the date for. So what I'm going to do inside DateSerial is type in 2020, followed by a comma, followed by 12 for the month, followed by 25 for the day, and then close the round brackets for the DateSerial function and the round brackets again for the DateDiff function. Having done that, I'm going to click OK to construct my expression. I'll just make sure that I have formatted the font in that text box, so I'll switch it to a different font compared to the default, and then switch it back to the default font again. And then if I run my report, I'll get a number which represents how many days it is until Christmas Day. I could add a bit of basic text to that as well, just to make it a little more readable. So if I click into the text box just before my expression, and then I can type in countdown to Christmas, for example. And then if I run my report again, I'll see I get the number followed by that string of text. So there we go, the absolute basics of using the DateDiff function. Now let's use the DateDiff function to do something a little more useful. I want to calculate how old each of my actors are in days. So to do that, we're going to add a calculated field to my actors dataset. So I'll right click actors, choose add calculated field, and then I'll call this column or call this field difference in days. I can then click the FX button and then head to my common functions category, date and time, double click DateDiff. I'll use the same interval that I used for the countdown to Christmas. I'll use date interval dot day, followed by a comma. This time the start date is represented by the value of a field. So I can then go to the fields list next to the actors dataset, find and double click on the DOB field, followed by a comma, and then I want to set the end date to be today's date. So I can head back to my date and time category of functions, scroll down to find the today function, give that a double click, close the round brackets for today, close another set of round brackets for DateDiff, click OK a couple of times, and then I can drop the difference in days function or column into my table, give the report a quick run, and you'll see the horrifyingly large number that represents how old somebody is in days. If you can find an actor who was born on or around about the same day that you were, you'll see the horrifyingly large number of days old that you are. It's worth noting that the DateDiff function also exists in SQL. So if you prefer, and if you have the option to, you might consider creating the difference in days column as an expression in the underlying select statement. Just to show how that would work, I'm going to right-click my actors dataset and choose dataset properties. I can then add a new column above my from clause by giving myself a blank line and then type in a new comma to begin a new column definition. I'll type in the DateDiff function and open up some round brackets. The order of the parameters is the same. I need to start by specifying an interval, followed by a start date and then an end date. The intervals are specified slightly differently in SQL. I can say either D or DD or the word day to specify differences in days. If I then type in a comma, I can set the start date to refer to the actor.dob column, followed by another comma, and then the end date would be today's date. The function which calculates today's date in SQL, or one of them at least, is getDate. And just like the today function in Visual Basic in Report Builder, there are no parameters, but we still need to open and close the round brackets immediately after the function name. If I then close another set of round brackets for the DateDiff function, I can assign an alias to this. I'll call it difference in days 2. Having done that, I'll click OK. And then I can drag the difference in days 2 column into my table, give the report a quick run, and I'll see that for every person but one in my database, everyone's calculated the exact same difference in days between the Visual Basic version and the SQL version. The one person who hasn't is Tom Cruise, the first person in the database. And the reason for that is that Tom Cruise is the only person in the database whose date of birth includes a time. And I'll just quickly prove that. I'll go back to my design view and I'll highlight the DOB cell in that table, head back to my number format property, and I'm just going to add on to the end of the number format, HH in all caps, followed by a colon, 2 lowercase m's and another colon, and 2 lowercase s's. So hours, minutes and seconds. If I run the report again, we'll see that Tom Cruise suddenly has an extra time component attached to his date of birth. Everybody else in the database has their time set to midnight, so the very first instant of that particular date. Whereas Tom Cruise has his date set to 6 minutes past 3. I'm not sure if that's actually accurate, but it was just used to demonstrate something on another training course. So basically this shows you that the DateDiff function in Visual Basic and that in SQL treat intervals slightly differently. The SQL version essentially ignores the time component entirely. If I ask for the difference in days, it gives me the difference in days regardless of what time of day it is. Whereas the Visual Basic version takes the time into account. Because Tom Cruise has not yet accumulated a full 21,351 days, it shows me the last whole day that he's accumulated. What if we wanted to ignore the time component? What could we do with that? Well, there are a couple of choices here. We could write our query, so the underlying select statement, to return only the date component of the date of birth and not return the time component at all. Alternatively, we could tell our DateDiff function in Visual Basic to ignore the time component. Let's take the second approach. I'm going to go back to the design view, and then I'm going to go back to my difference in days function or column by right-clicking on it and choose Field Properties. I'll then click the FX button to the right-hand side. And what I'd like to do is modify the way this date of birth value is treated, not as the entire date and time, but just the date component of that. We can actually use one of the two functions I briefly mentioned earlier on when we were entering the value for Christmas Day 2020. If I go back to the Common Functions category and select date and time, we've got an option for date value, which allows you to pass in any relevant string which represents a date, and it will return a date whose time is set to midnight. The DateSerial function does the same thing. It returns a date whose time is set to midnight, but by passing in the year and month and day of a date. The easiest option to go for here is to use the DateValue function to pass in the value of the date and time of birth and return just the date set to midnight. So I'm going to click just before fields dob.value and then double click the DateValue function to have that typed in and the open round brackets. Just before the comma after the dot value, I can close a set of round brackets and then click OK a couple of times. And then if I run the report again, we'll find that now the values are the same in each column because the time component is being ignored. I'll just head back to the design view and then I'll switch that date format back so it excludes the time component. I'll get rid of the HHMMSS part. Give the report one final quick test just to make sure it all looks sensible. So there we go, the basics of DateDiff for calculating the difference in days. So far we've been comparing the actor's date of birth with today's date to calculate the difference in days. What I want to do now is move on and look at how we can compare the actor's date of birth with the date of death if there's one available. What I'll do first is head back to the design view and right click the difference in days field in the actors dataset, choose field properties and then click the FX button next to the expression box. If I just tried to replace the today function with a reference to the DoD column instead, I'll get rid of the today function and its open and close round brackets and then double click the DoD field. I'll then click OK and OK again, run the report. And while I'll get an accurate value now for each person who has stopped accumulating days in the past, so you'll see a difference between the DateDiff in the Visual Basic and the SQL columns now, everyone who doesn't actually have a date of death yet has a completely inaccurate value. What I want to do is check if the date of death is empty, then use the current date, today, otherwise use the value in the date of death column. Back in the design view, to modify that, I can right-click my difference in days function or column and choose field properties. Head back to the expression builder by clicking the FX button. I'm just going to tidy up the layout of this expression a little. I'm going to take each parameter, each argument I'm passing to each parameter, onto a separate line by pressing enter and then typing in a few spaces just to indent those values a little bit. Just makes it slightly easier to read when we have longer expressions to write. So what I want to do here, rather than always using the date of death value, I want to check first of all if that value is empty or nothing. So I can do this using a pair of functions. I can use the program flow category to insert the if function, and then the inspection category to insert the isNothing function. So if isNothing fields dod.value. After the close round brackets there, I'll type in a comma, and if there is nothing in the DoD column, I want to use today's date instead. So into the date and time category, I can scroll down and double click the today function, and then close the round brackets to finish that. I can type in another comma, and then finally I have to say what value I want to use if there is a value in the DoD column. And it's the value of the DoD column, so it's a little bit repetitive here, but I have to insert the DoD column value again. I then need to close a set of round brackets for the if function and a corresponding set of close round brackets for the DateDiff function. And having done that, I can click OK, OK again, and then have a quick look at the results to see that everyone should now have an accurate difference in days, regardless of whether or not they have a date of death value filled in. We can do the same thing in SQL. It's a little easier, I think, in SQL to do this. If I go back to the report design view and then right-click actors and choose dataset properties. So currently my DateDiff function is always using the current date, using the getDate function. Just before getDate, I'm going to write isNull, open some round brackets, actor.dod, followed by a comma, and then just close one extra set of round brackets at the end of the expression to correspond with the opening round brackets for isNull. So the isNull function here is using the same logic that we've constructed in Visual Basic using if isNothing. It's just a little more elegant to write this. isNull attempts to use this first value that we enter, but if there's nothing there to be used, it immediately jumps to the second value we provided and uses that instead. So it's logically the same, just with a more compact, concise syntax. So now that we've done that, we can click OK and give the report another quick run, and we should see now that the column values match between the Visual Basic and the SQL versions again. The next thing I'd like to do is calculate the difference in years between the actor's date of birth and then either their date of death or the current date. And just so that I don't have to continue checking if the date of death column is nothing, I'm going to create a new calculated field that tells me what the end date is. So I'm going to right click the actor's dataset and choose Add Calculated Field. And I'll call this one End Date, and then hit the FX button. And all I'm going to do is use the same logic I've just used in the previous example. I'll head to the Program Flow category and double click If, then the Inspection category and hit Is Nothing, and then refer to the fields DOD. I'll close the round brackets for the Is Nothing function, followed by a comma. Head back to the Date and Time category and then double click the Today function. Don't forget to close the extra set of round brackets, followed by one more comma, back to the fields list and double click DOD, and finally close one more set of round brackets. So this column will simply hold the end date that I want to use for any actor. If the DOD is nothing, then it will use today's date, otherwise it will use the value in the DOD column. I can do the exact same thing in SQL as well. If I've got an end date column in Visual Basic, I could replicate that in the underlying SQL query if I right click Actors and choose Dataset Properties. I can add a new column by adding a comma, and then I can just copy and paste the isNull expression here. I'll take isNull, actor DOD, get date, open and close one set of round brackets and an extra set of round brackets. So two sets of round brackets closed at the end, and I'll call this one as end date 2. So that's what that expression should look like. Either way, it doesn't matter which one you use, whether you use the Visual Basic or the SQL version, that will contain a column now which gives us the end date to use for each person. I'm just going to drag that into my table, and I'll drag it next to the DOD column so we can clearly see that where the DOD is empty, I've got the current date, today's date used. Otherwise, I've got the actual date of that actor's date of death. So that's perfect. I'll head back to the design view, and now we can look at how to calculate the difference in years between the date of birth and the end date. Let's right click on the actor's dataset and choose Add Calculated Field. And I'll call this column Difference in Years. And I'll spell that correctly as well. And then I can hit the FX button and head straight to the Common Functions Date and Time category and double click the DateDiff function. I've got some examples already in the bottom right hand corner that show how to specify an interval of years. So I'll type in date interval dot year, followed by a comma, and then my start date and end date I can simply refer to two existing fields. I'll go for the DOB field first, and then the end date field second. You're welcome to use end date too if you prefer, it doesn't really matter here. But I can close the round brackets, hit OK, and then hit OK again. Just to show the exact same example in SQL before we add them into the table, let's right click the actor's dataset and choose Dataset Properties. The easiest thing to do here is just to copy the DateDiff expression from earlier. So I'm going to copy the entire expression, including most of the alias, as difference in, and then I can paste that in on the next line in the select list. Now the reason I'm copying and pasting here and not constructing it again to reference the end date 2 column is because sadly in SQL you can't reference a column you've created, an expression column you've created in the same select list. So what I have to do is nest the isNull function in here to check if the actor's date of death is null, then use the current date instead. I'll just change the interval from day to year, and then I'll change the alias to difference in years 2. I'll click OK, and then I'm going to first of all delete the difference in days columns. I'll highlight both of those and then right click and delete them, just to give myself a bit more space more than anything. And then I can drag my difference in years column to the end of the table, difference in years too, and then give the report a quick run just so we can see the result, and it should match for every single person this time, no differences whatsoever. So difference in years. Now, I was very deliberate in calling these columns difference in years rather than age in years, because age isn't quite what we've calculated here, although it might look like that from the surface. Just to show that that's the case, I'm going to do a quick bit of sorting in this table. I'm going to right click on, first of all, I'm going to select a cell in the table and then right click on one of the grey boxes around the outside so that I can select Tablix or Tablix properties. I can then go to the sorting page in there, and I'm going to add a sort, first of all, to sort in descending order of month for each actor's date of birth. So I need to calculate that first. I could create it in a calculated field and then just pick it from this drop-down list here. But as I'm already in the dialog box, I'm going to click the FX button and use the month function to calculate the number of the month of each actor's date of birth. So month fields dob.value. That's what that should look like. And then having done that, I can click OK and then choose to sort in descending order Z to A. I'll add a second sort to sort in descending order of day of the month. So there's a function called day. If you've watched the previous video in this series, you'll be familiar with these functions that I'm using here. So day fields dob.value. And again, I'll go in descending order when I've clicked OK once. And then just to complete the set, I'll go with the sorting in descending order of year as well. So I'll go to the expression box and I'll go for the year function. And then again, refer to the DOB field. And then click OK and sort in descending order. I'll just tidy up my table a little as well. Rather than showing the DOD column any longer, I'll select and then right click and delete that column. Then apply a bit of basic formatting to the end date so that it matches the formatting of the start date. So DDMMMYYYY. And then if I run my report now, we should see something of a difference here. So I've got the start date or the date of birth and the end date being used, and I'm calculating the difference between those dates, and it all looks fairly sensible, difference in years. But if you looked at the actual date of today, so today is the 16th of December 2020. And on the 31st of December 2020, Val Kilmer is going to become 61 years old. However, my difference in years column tells me that Val Kilmer already is 61, which he might be a little bit upset about. So that's true for everybody. If we look at this list, if you compare their birthdays, their birth dates with the date we're calculating with, everyone is being reported as 1 year too old. And that continues to be the case until we get down to the end of the list and switch into the 16th of December. So when we get to 16th of December, which is the current date, of course, then everyone's being reported as the correct age. It's easy to spot with people like Jennifer Connolly, who was born in 1970. So 12th of December 1970, 16th of December 2020, she definitely is 50 at this point. Her birthday has passed. But for people whose birthday has not yet occurred in this year, they're being reported as 1 year too old. So let's head back to the design view and have a look at what we can do to solve that problem. We have a variety of ways for how we can solve this problem, and I'm going to start by showing you a slightly quick and dirty method. It's not one that I'd recommend in the real world, and you'll see why in a moment, although you do see lots of people using this technique. Let's add a new calculated field to the actors dataset. I'll right click and choose Add Calculated Field. And just to give you a clue to the technique we're about to use, I'll call this divide by 365. It'll give us a rough and ready answer, not quite 100% accurate as you'll see, but let's go for it anyway. Let's hit the FX button at the right hand side, and then I will refer to a field in which I've already calculated the difference in days. So I'll go to the difference in days column. Of course, I could calculate that again, but it seems pointless as I already have the column created anyway. Then I want to divide that by 365. I'll click OK and then click OK again. And then I will add that column to my table. give the report a quick run, and I'll see that if I just ignore the top 3 rows for the moment and have a look at Eliza Dushku, who was previously being reported as 40, her age is now 39.989, etc. So pretty much most people have, not everyone of course, the top 3, so Val Kilmer is still 61 and Ben Kingsley 77, Ted Danson further down the list is still 73 rather than 72. But it's kind of getting closer, isn't it? The problem the mistake we've made here, or I've made here, is that I haven't taken into account leap years. So not every year has exactly 365 days in it. So what we could do is head back to the design view and then right-click Divide by 365, choose Field Properties, click the FX button at the right-hand side, and then just increase this by 0.25 to roughly take into account leap years. I can then click OK and OK again, run the report one more time, and now everybody should be 1 year less than they were previously being reported as. So that's working for all the people whose birthday has not yet occurred. If I scroll downwards and make sure I can check that people who have had their birthdays haven't been affected by that. So Miranda Otto is still 53 and Xander Berkeley is still 65, etc. Oh, but now, oh, I'm sorry, Noel Coward has a date of death, sorry, so he died in March of that year, so that's correct. He should be reduced by 73 rather than 74. So yeah, that looks like it's working. It's just all a bit messy, isn't it? The formatting, first of all, we'd have to sort out the formatting. I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. But what if we were calculating the difference between dates which didn't even span a leap year? Then we've got another inaccuracy in our calculation. So we're never going to get absolutely the 100% accurate result using this technique. It's fine for rough and ready stuff, but we can do so much better with a tiny little bit more effort. Let's just tidy up this result first. If I go back to the design view, I want to get rid of any of the decimal places without formatting. If I format it just using the number formats, that will round up. So what I'm going to do is calculate just the integer portion of that number. I'll right click on the Divide by 365 field, choose Field Properties, hit the FX button at the right hand side, and then I'm going to use a function, one of the conversion functions. If I look at the common functions category and look at conversion, I'll find that there's an int function in there, which returns the whole number portion, the integer portion of a number. And you'll see an example very similar to what we've just done here, to divide a value and then return the whole number portion of that. So I can type in int, open some round brackets, close the round brackets at the end, hit OK a couple of times, run the report just to quickly check that it looks a little bit neater, which I think it does. But let's head back to the design view and look at a slightly more accurate answer. The other techniques we'll look at from this point basically rely on calculating whether or not somebody's birth date has passed in the current year. So if we think about the basic logic as our first example, if the month of somebody's date of birth is greater than the month of the current date, then we know their birthday hasn't passed yet. If the month of the person's date of birth is the same as the month of the current date, but the day of the person's date of birth is greater than the day of the current date, then we also know that their birthday has not passed yet. So in either of those two circumstances, we want to subtract 1 from the result returned by the difference in years expression. So let's look at that in sort of a full complicated if function first. Let's right click actors and choose add calculated field. And we'll call this one using if, or tell you what, age in years with if, something along those lines. Then we can click the FX button, and I'll start, of course, by using the if function. So equals IIF, open some round brackets. Now I'm definitely going to use multiple lines here because the expression is going to get quite long. So I'm going to go to the next line, type in a few spaces to indent. And the first condition I want to check is whether the month of the actor's date of birth is greater than the month of the end date that we're comparing it with. So I'm going to use the month function, and then I'm going to go to my fields list and double click DOB, close the round brackets, and then check if that is greater than month open some round brackets, and then check the end date, and then close the round brackets. So of course, because we're in December at this point, this is a little bit of an irrelevance to test. But of course, if we get to if we're in any earlier month, then this is important. So that's if the month is greater than. We know that the birthday cannot possibly have passed in the current year. So I also want to check then using the OR operator. So if that condition isn't true, but the next one is, so I'm going to go down to the next line and type in a few spaces and open up some round brackets because I've got two conditions to test for now. And the first condition is actually checking whether the month of the date of birth is equal to the month of the end date. So I'm going to just copy and paste that part of my expression and then change the greater than symbol to the equals symbol instead. So if I am in the current month and the day of the date of birth is after the day of the end date. So I'm going to use the AND logical operator. And then on the next line, giving myself a few new spaces. I think the easiest thing again to do here is to copy and paste the first logical test I performed. And then change the name of the functions there from month to day. So that's about the shortest way I can think of to do that. If I can then close an extra set of round brackets there to combine these two conditions into one single logical test. So if either this is true or both of these are true, then I know that the person's birth date has not yet passed. So they should be 1 year less than their difference in years calculation generates. So I'm going to type in a comma at the end of that expression and then hit enter to go down to the next line. Give myself a few spaces. Then I can refer to one of my two difference in years columns. I'll go for the original difference in years and simply subtract 1 from it, followed by another comma and then another few spaces on the next line and enter the difference in years field again. I can then close the round brackets and then click OK a couple of times. And if I drag age in years with if into my table and run that report, I will now see that I get a much more accurate picture. So everyone whose birthday has not yet passed, so everyone from whose birthday falls on the 17th of December or later, will be being reported as 1 year less than they currently are. Everyone born on the 16th of December or earlier will still be the same age, as you can see. So it's a little long-winded to type in, but it's way more accurate than the divide by 365 version. I think the main issue with that previous example is how long it takes to type in, and unless we get every single bracket and comma in exactly the right place, the whole thing just falls over. So we can shorten it a little bit. We can take a few shortcuts with this. I'm just going to go back to the expression we've just created. I'm going to right click on it and choose field properties and then hit the FX button. And then what I'm going to do is copy just the logical test part. I'm going to get everything from the month function, the original month function, all the way through to the end of the double closed round brackets. And I'm just going to copy that to the clipboard for the time being. If I then just cancel out of that dialog box, and while I'm here, I'm going to add a new calculated field. And I'll call this one, I'll call it shorthand or shortcut or something along those lines, and then hit the FX button. Then I'm just going to paste in that logical test. So without the if function wrapped around it, basically what this is doing is checking whether a person's birthday is yet to occur in the current year. So if I click OK and OK again, and I drag the shorthand column into the table, I'll just tidy things up a little bit by getting rid of the divide by 365 and one of the difference in years columns. Let's delete 2 of those to get the report a little bit neater. If I run the report now, what we're going to see is that for anybody whose birthday has not yet passed, the value returned is true, so their birthday is yet to occur in the current year. if I scroll down to 16th of December, we'll find that these people have already had their birthdays. Of course, there are a few trues dotted around in there. That's for people whose date of death has been populated. So people who died before their birthday in the current year. So why is that useful? Well, that's useful whenever you've got true or false values. You can treat true and falses as numeric values. And just to show you what numeric values true and false represent in Visual Basic, I'm going to head back to the design view and I'm going to right click the shorthand field, choose field properties, hit the FX button at the right hand side, and I'm going to wrap the int function around that complete set of logical tests. So int, open some round brackets, and then close an extra set of round brackets right at the end, just as we did to get rid of the decimal places for the divide by 365 example. If I click OK now and then click OK again and run the report, we'll see that the values for true and false have been converted into ones and zeros, which is kind of interesting. So what we could do now is we could take the result of that and subtract it from the difference in years column. So back into the design view, I'm going to right click shorthand, I'll go to field properties, hit the FX button, and then just above the int function, I'll take that down to the next line in fact, and give myself a few spaces. I'm going to start by referring to the difference in years column, and then simply subtract from that the result of that logical test, which will either be the value 1 or 0, and it will subtract 1 when the person's birthday has not yet occurred in the current year. So the end result of this, if I click OK a couple of times and then run the report, is I get the exact same answer yet again, just using a slightly shorthand version of the big if statement. And if I just scroll down just to quickly show you and prove that on the next page, the results are still the same. So there we go, a slight shorthand method for doing the long complicated if function. For the next example, we'll go a step further, and rather than comparing the day and the month separately, I'd like to combine them along with a year to construct a full date which we can compare against the end date that we're checking. So this is going to rely on one of the functions we saw earlier on in the video to build a complete date out of separate parts. Let's add a new calculated field, and I'm going to call this one, I'm going to call it anniversary date. And what we're going to try to do is calculate the date on which somebody will become the age they will turn in this current year. I'll explain that a little better as we go along, I hope. If I hit the FX button, what I'd like to do is, first of all, I want to construct a complete date from the year and month and day components. And we saw the function which does that earlier on in the video. We looked at the DateSerial function. So if I go to my date and time category, I'm going to insert the DateSerial function. The first value is the year, and I want to calculate the year for the end date that we're comparing the actor's date of birth with. So again, I can either insert the year function or just type it in, but I'll go for the year function, head to the fields list, and I'm going to insert the end date function. So for anybody who has not yet passed away, the end date, the end year, will be 2020, the current year. For anyone who does have a DoD, that will be the year in which they passed away. I'll then type in a comma, and I want to now reference the month, but I want to get the month of the actor's date of birth. So I'm going to double click the DOB column, and then close the round brackets for month. Another comma, and then the day function. And again, I want to base that upon the actor's day of birth. So I'm going to insert the DOB field again, close one set of round brackets for the day function, and another set of round brackets for the DateSerial. Just to tidy up the layout of that, just to make it a little more readable, I'll take each of these parameters onto a separate line, and then we'll give a quick check of the report. If I just zoom in so you can see the result there. If I click OK a couple of times and then drag anniversary date into the table, give the report a quick run, we'll basically see the date on which each person becomes the age reported by difference in years. So Eliza Dushku will turn 40 on 30th of the 12th, 2020. That's what we're trying to do there. Now that we've got that value calculated, we can compare the anniversary date with the end date, because if the anniversary date is after the end date, we know the person has not yet had that birthday. So back to the design view, we could do this using an if statement, or even more simply, we could use the same little trick we've just used to generate the numbers 1 and 0 with the basic logical test. So let's add a new column. I'm going to add a calculated field, and I'll call this one age in years date serial. I'll click the FX button at the right hand side, and then I want to start by referring to the difference in years column, and I would like to subtract from that the int version. So I'm going to use the int function again, and I want to check if the anniversary date is greater than, excuse me, I'll get the correct symbol in a moment, greater than the end date. And then I can close the round brackets there. So as we saw earlier on, the int function converts the true false values of a logical test into a 1 and a 0. So if the anniversary date is after the end date, I'll return a 1. So I'll subtract 1 from the difference in years. Otherwise, I'll subtract 0 from the difference in years. Again, don't forget, we could nest the DateSerial function here to calculate the anniversary date rather than having it in separate columns. But rather, as I've already calculated it, it makes sense to reference that column as it's available. Anyway, having done that, if I click OK a couple of times and add age in years DateSerial into the table, I can give the report a quick run and see once again the age in years is being reported accurately for people whose birthday has not yet passed. So we compare this against the difference in years column. And if I scroll down the list and get to the second page, where people whose birthday is on the 16th of December, their age is still being reported correctly as well. I think that's an even more elegant solution than the one we just looked at using the sequence of logical tests. Obviously, it's more elegant at the expense of readability, but I think it's worth it. The final example we'll create in Visual Basic will rely on a similar technique to the one we've just used. We're going to check if a particular date has passed or not. But this time, rather than using the year, we'll just rely on the month and the day. I'll start by creating a couple of helper columns. I'm going to right click on the actors dataset and choose add calculated field. And I'm going to call this one DOB MDD. The MDD there represents the date format I'm about to use to format the date of birth. If I hit the FX button, I'm going to use a function called format, which I'll find in the text category. You may remember this from the previous video in the series if you've watched that. I'll insert the format function first, then head back to the fields list and double click the DOB field, followed by a comma, and then in some double quotes, a single capital M and 2 lowercase d's. I'll close the double quotes and close the round brackets. So the format code that I've used there will use a single digit for the month, unless the month was the 10th, 11th or 12th, in which case it will use 2 digits, of course. So if it was December, it would come out as 12. And then the 2 digits, the 2 Ds there for the days, will return 2 digits. So if it was born on the 1st of December, then the actor will come out as 1201. It's probably easier just to show you this actually. Let's click OK and OK again. Add that field. In fact, I'll tidy up my table a bit first. Let's get rid of the columns to the right of difference in years. And then I'll add DOB MDD into the table, give it a quick run, and we'll see Val Kilmer, born on the 31st of December, has a date of birth MDD as 1231. And as I scroll further down the list, you'll see we get a numerical representation of each actor's date of birth. I say a number, it's not actually a number just yet. It's currently being returned as a string, as all values returned by the format function are returned as strings. I want to make sure that this is converted into a number. So you might be able to spot that all the values here in this column are aligned to the left of the cell, indicating that it's text rather than a number. So if I go back to the design view and then right-click my DOB-MDD field, choose Field Properties, hit the FX button on the right-hand side, and then wrap the int function around this once again. So the end result looks like so. Don't forget the extra closed round brackets at the end. If I hit OK a couple of times, run the report again, and now see all those values are aligned at the right of the cell, indicating that they are indeed numbers. All I want to do then is construct a similar number for the end date. So I'm going to go back to the design view and I'll add a second helper column. I'll go for add calculated field, and I'll call this one end MDD, and then I'll hit the FX button at the right hand side. I know that I'm going to use an int function, so I'll type that in first, and then a format function, so I'll type that in as well and try to spell it correctly. And then I want to reference my end date field. I'll double click to insert that, followed by a comma, and then in some double quotes, a single capital M, two lowercase d's, close the double quotes, and close two sets of round brackets. If I then click OK and OK again, I can drag end MDD into the table, have a quick look at running the report, and I can see I've got another number now representing the date of that person's anniversary, so the date on which they will become the age reported by difference in years. So, beg your pardon, sorry, that's the wrong way round. Then DOB-MDD, that represents the date on which the person will become that age in years. This represents the current end date, whether that's today's date, or if there is a value in there, the date of death instead. So all we need to do now is check whether the value in this column, date of birth MDD, is greater than the value in this column, and if so, we know that this person is 1 year too old according to the difference in years. So the exact same technique we've just used, if I head back to the design view, I'm going to add one more calculated field. I'll say age in years with format, and then hit the FX button. And I'm going to refer first of all to my difference in years field. And I'm going to subtract from that on the next line, int, open some round brackets, DOB MDD value greater than end MDD. Close the round brackets. So the logic there is essentially the same. And again, I could have calculated the format function. I could have wrapped in the format function here rather than referenced my existing columns. But as I've already calculated these two values, it makes sense to reference the existing columns. So having done that, if I zoom back out and hit OK a couple of times, add age in years with format, hit the run button again, I should now see everybody whose birthday has not yet passed being reported as 1 year less than their difference in years. But for everyone whose birthday has passed, they're being reported still as the current difference in years. Apart from, unless their date of death has been filled in, of course, in which case they'll have one subtracted from the difference in years. The principle there is kind of similar to what we did with the DateSerial function, of course, just an alternative approach. And you can take any of those, whichever one you like the most, I suppose. The one to avoid, though, is divide by 365. That one's rubbish. Don't use that. Just to finish off, of course, we could have done all those calculations in SQL in the underlying select statement, but because in SQL you can't reference a previous column in the same select list, it's all a little bit more awkward. just to give you one quick example of that, we'll replicate the final example we did in Visual Basic in the equivalent SQL expression. There's a couple of differences you'll need to know about if you wanted to do this. So I'm going to right-click on my actors dataset and use dataset properties, and then I'm going to give myself a new line in the select list, followed by a couple of spaces and a comma to begin a new column. The first thing I want to do is work out the difference in years between the actor's date of birth and either the date of death or today's date. So actually, the difference in years to column definition is the first part of this expression. I can't reference it. I've got to calculate that again, sadly. From there, what I'd like to do is subtract either 1 or 0 based on whether the day and month number is greater than the day and month number of the end date. But again, sadly, I can't reference previous columns, so I've got to calculate the entire thing from scratch. Also, slightly annoyingly, I can't just drop in the basic conditional statement. I can't convert true and false directly into the numbers 1 and 0 in SQL, or at least as far as I'm aware. So the way I tend to do this is if I add a new line, no new comma this time, so I'm carrying on the same column definition. I'm going to write an if function, so IIF, open some round brackets, and then I'm going to use the cast function to convert the data type. So there's no int function in SQL. I can use the cast function to convert something into an integer. And what I would like to convert into an integer is the format, or the formatted version of the actor's date of birth. So I'll use the format function, say actor dot, I'll spell actor correctly as well, actor dot DOB, followed by a comma, and then I'll use the same custom format MDD, but as I'm in SQL, I'll need to use single quotes rather than double quotes, so a capital M and 2 lowercase d's. I'll close the round brackets for the format function and then say as int to convert the result of that format function into an integer. I'll then close a set of round brackets for the cast function, and I want to check if that is greater than the same formatted date but for the end date that I'm using. So to make this a little easier, rather than type it all out again from scratch, I'm going to copy the entire cast expression. I'll give myself a new line, a few extra spaces, try to line things up reasonably closely. So that's the syntax is the same, the logic is the same here. I'm formatting a date as MDD and returning it as an integer, but it's not the actor's date of birth I want. What I want is the end date I'm using. So here, annoyingly again, because I can't reference the end date column, I need to make a copy of the isNull actor.dod get date expression. So I'll copy that and replace actor.dob with that expression. Okay, so that's the logical test part. All of that is the first parameter of my if function. If that's true, the value that I'm trying to subtract is a 1. So I'll type in a comma and then say 1. I'll type in another comma and say 0. So if the condition is false, don't subtract anything. I'll then close a set of round brackets for that function and then give it a quick alias as age in years. I might be able to zoom in so you can see the entire thing. I'm not sure you want to bother copying all of that out, but you're more than welcome to if you do. Anyway, let's see how good my syntax is if I click OK and then drop my age in years function, if I can find it, age in years column into my table. I'll just drop this at the end of the table, give the report a quick run, and I should see that the SQL version returns exactly the same results as the Visual Basic version, just done in SQL rather than Visual Basic. So there you go. There's a whole bunch of different techniques for calculating differences between dates, including how to calculate age in years accurately. Of course, you'll find practical examples for that in the real world. It won't just be based on ages of people. It might be based on delivery dates for orders or for projects. It might be based on length of service for people, but all the same techniques will apply. So hopefully you'll get some mileage out of some of that. Thanks for watching. See you next time.